did say that you found, you were surprised by India's vibrant democracy. How does it fare? Or what is your understanding of what makes it thrive or what makes it work as a democracy, as opposed to, say, countries like in Latin America, for example,
Sure.
which are comparable in terms of economy? What makes them not such healthy democracies, and what is it that makes India such a healthy democracy?
So first, I want to be very clear. We can all debate definitions of democracy, and I've had journalists say, "Well, how can a country be a democracy when?" And they'll give me an example. Some injustice has happened, and I could go to any country, including Australia, and point to some injustice that has happened. I mean, during coronavirus in Australia, a pregnant woman had police come to her home and arrest her for making a post on Facebook that was opposed to government policy on coronavirus. They arrested a pregnant woman, and unbelievable, right? How could a country be a democracy where that happens? And the answer is that things happen everywhere. Inappropriate things happen everywhere. I'd like to do some kind of systematic study, and the clear cut. I mean, it's difficult to measure things like human rights because that's all driven by individual stories that then get aggregated. Let's take just a very rough cut. Does a country have regular elections with peaceful rotation of government in power? Now, I know that's not the sum total of democracy, but that's a bare minimum requirement. I mean, if you don't have regular elections on schedule, and if the person who loses steps down, then you don't have democracy. Okay, so just a first cut definition of democracy. Again, I want to be clear. I'm not claiming that's all there is. Of course, democracy requires a free press. Democracy requires human rights. But, first cut, does it have elections? You can't find another country of GDP per capita less than about $8,000 per year that has had even 3 decades of widely acknowledged to be free and fair elections with peaceful rotation of parties in government. Okay, can't find a single one. Maybe there's, I'm sorry, I say that categorically. There might be a small island state somewhere. I mean, no country more than 1 million population.
Not the size of India or...
Well, not of any substantial. So, I mean, I'm just saying, when I say not a single one, someone might say, but you're forgetting about some obscure island, among countries with more than 1 million population. There's not a single one under $8,000 or so GDP per capita that has just that basic definition. So that's what drove me to move from my own natural approach, which is quantitative cross-national studies, to start doing a much more literary, much deeper, more what we call technically idiographic, that is specific to the particular case, approach to studying India. And what attracted me was both that fact that India is such an outlier, but also the fact that the literature is in English. I mean, of course, you can improve your knowledge of India if you speak Hindi, if you read Sanskrit, if you read regional languages. But in practice, the political discourse is conducted in English. Again, not the politics. Politics is local. But the discourse about democracy, if I want to find major books by major authors about democracy in India, 98% of them are in English. And so I have access to the literature. So for me, that was a real attraction. If I wanted to study China, I could study the Chinese economy. That's not a problem. But it's difficult for me to study the Chinese political system because I don't speak Chinese. And I would always defer to sinologists when it came to understanding the political system. But with India, there's this great opportunity that you don't have to be a country specialist to be able to really understand Indian democracy. The same way that so many people are not really Americanologists, but they still understand American democracy. Why? Well, because they can watch the TV, they can read the newspapers, they can read the authors, they can engage in the discussion. Well, India is open to that same sort of analysis. As a result, for the last 3 years, I've just been doing such a deep dive into Indian democracy, whether that's current events. So I follow, I'm always getting advice from people. No, don't follow that person. I don't like this person. Look, I listen to everybody, but the people I found especially useful, current day commentators. Number one, first and foremost, absolutely, I do 6 days a week of Shekhar Gupta. Now, I know people have strong feelings about Shekhar Gupta. I do 5 days a week of Cut the Clutter and 1 day a week of National Interest. Every week, Karan Thapar. I know a lot of people have strong feelings about Karan Thapar, but I listen to him every week. Since I met him, I now every week listen to Rajdeep Sardesai. Again, I know people have very strong feelings, but now, so when I see people, and I've seen a lot of accusations is the only word I can have for it on Twitter and the media, that I'm some kind of Hindu right winger. And I say, well, who am I learning about India from? I'm learning from Shekhar Gupta and
You're so as anti-Hindu as they can get.
And these are the prime. Now, I listen to others as well, and I listen to Citti Media, and there are also many other. I don't limit myself to these people, but they are my every week sort of people. Now, I also read the Indian Express.
Yes.
So again, if people want to say, oh, yes, I have a subscription to Swarajya, and I have subscriptions to other, but my primary everyday, I read it on the app, is Indian Express. My second one is India Today. Those are my two primary news sources. Again, not politicized news sources.
Do you use these sources for news, or do you use these for opinions? That's
news, opinion. I want to learn about what the debates are. And look, I don't think just because you read someone's opinion doesn't mean that you have to adopt that person's opinion. It's very useful to hear what people have to say. And I find these sources, certainly India Today, I find publishes a wide variety of opinion. And it's kept me up to date on what the big issues are in Indian politics. That said, my study of democracy goes back primarily to the 1930s. I've been reading through the independence literature. And what's really fantastic about the Indian independence literature is it's the only independence literature that is on the same scale and time frame as the American independence literature. So many people read the U.S. founding fathers because they thought deeply. They knew they were going to have a democracy, and they thought deeply, what will our democracy look like when we get independence from Britain? All throughout the Revolutionary War, people were writing about what we should have as a constitution in the United States. There was a huge, long-standing debate on it. And of course, we had a constitutional convention that went on for a long period, and there are records from the Constitutional Convention. India has all the same thing. On top of that, India's founding fathers mainly wrote books. So whereas U.S. founding fathers, for the most part, wrote short pamphlets, and they wrote those pamphlets anonymously. Look, not everybody. Thomas Jefferson wrote a book. John Adams wrote a book. Benjamin Franklin wrote a book. But most of these were anonymous pamphlets. If you want to read Alexander Hamilton's Thoughts on Democracy, you have to read pamphlets in the Federalist Papers that are attributed to Hamilton, but we don't really know that they were written by Hamilton. Well, in India, no. I mean, yes, they're the Indians' democracy activists or democracy leaders also wrote short pieces for newspapers, but every one of them, probably except Sardar Patel. I mean, Sardar Patel, I get the feeling, was not a literary man.
Yeah, I think he was more of a ground.
He was a doer, but everyone else wrote books. So I started with Hind Swaraj. But I read everyone I could reach. I read Savarkar. Of course, I read.
He shared an article on him in your Twitter.
Yeah, well, I've read a lot of Savarkar, and now I'm audiobooking Vikram Sampath's biography of Savarkar. But of course, I read Nehru's Discovery of India. I've read Ambedkar's book on partition. I'm now losing track of all the books on partition I've read from the times. Everyone, some of them were written anonymously. So there were some written by Muslim League activists, again, about partition anonymously. I've read Jinnah's speeches. So much of that literature is so extensive that you just don't have to dig very far. It's not like you have to go into obscure archives. You can just get the book out of the library. I've become a big fan of Deen Dayal Upadhyaya. I'm going further, and forgive me, those of you, I know I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. This is my American pronunciation. But so his book on integral humanism is fantastic. I've read his speeches, his political speeches as well. So I've just enjoyed getting a primary source knowledge of Indian democracy. And it is really striking because in most other post-colonial societies, there's one major writer, father of the country figure who wrote, Mao's Little Red Book and such, and most of these books, whether it's Mao or Ho Chi Minh or even in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, they wrote books of aphorisms. They were not necessarily literary men. Most of India's democracy leaders were extraordinarily literate and literary. The books are not only fully present their viewpoints, but they're all a pleasure to read.
Pleasure to read. That's right.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.